went to buy lumber for the forms. We needed to form up the footers, for the above ground portion of the footers. And lumber's, pretty pricey right now, and so I got to calculating how much the lumber would cost and realized that the lumber for the footers was going to be almost as expensive as the concrete for the footers, which is crazy. Because we're just framing up the above ground portion of the footer, and that was going to be almost as much as all the concrete for the footer. So because it was so pricey, we decided to go ahead and just do the footer in two sections, do half at a time, and buy enough lumber to do half of the footers and then pour that and then move those footers over to the other side when we do the second half. And so went ahead and purchased enough lumber to do, one half of the footer and started assembling here. I built the forms off to the side in 12-foot sections so that I could just set them over the trench when I got ready in 12-foot sections and just kind of build the forms that way on top of the trench as I went along. It's a little bit difficult working around the trench. You don't want to spend too much time actually on the trench because anytime you're walking around the trench, there's the possibility of, caving in a part of the trench or scuffing dirt into the hole, which you're trying to keep clean. So I built them off to the side so I could just kind of gently set them on over the trench and then kind of start leveling and working with them in place once we got them in place, and kind of minimize the amount of work that I had to do actually, on top of the trench itself. Before we started setting the forms on the trench, I wanted to get the bottom course of rebar in, so I'm putting 2 half-inch strings of rebar, 2 strings of half-inch rebar in the bottom of the trench, about 3 inches from the bottom. Apparently the rebar is supposed to be placed near the top of the footer and near the bottom of the footer for, the maximum benefit from the rebar. So anyway, that needed to be set in the trench before we put the forms on. So we set those in the trench on little brackets that are made for that purpose and got the 2 bottom runs in. And then I started, prefabbing some boards and stuff that I would need to make adjustments to the forms once I set them over the trench, and also to connect the 12-foot sections of the form together. And then we started, just kind of placing them over the trench, connecting them together, using boards to kind of get them level and bring them into alignment. And we just kind of built out, got them kind of roughly in place along both sides, and then started the fine-tuning process of getting them perfectly level and true and straight and in exactly the right location before I started staking them down. Here we're starting to work on the east side of the footer, putting in the rebar there. Did have to do some bends to go around the corner to get those 2 bottom courses of rebar in, and I was able to just bend those basically by hand. Put my foot on the rebar and bend it up. Later on, we did have a friend come by, and he loaned us a tool that's made especially for bending rebar, but this worked. Was able to do okay just bending it by hand. So we made the bends, went around the corner, and then I had to do, once we got all the framing laid for that east side, then I had to connect the north side and the east side of the footers by hand. So I had to do some carpentry there to connect the 2 lines of forms and make that corner. So once I got all the forms in place and the corner connected and everything, I was ready to start making the fine-tuning adjustments where I would, prop up the forms and to get them all level and true. I had a couple different options on how to get the forms perfectly level. I could have used the transit, which would have worked fine. I would have just had to set the transit off to the side and have April, go around with the measuring stick, and I could have got the elevations that way and got it really accurate. But that kind of takes two people, and if you're making fine-tuning adjustments to the forms, there'd be a lot of running back and forth to the transit. So what seemed like a better way is to use just an old-fashioned, super simple technology it's called a water level. And basically it's where you get a long piece of tubing. We got a 100-foot length of tubing. I think they recommend a tubing with an internal diameter of 5/16. The tubing we're using here had a 1/4 inch internal diameter. And then you fill it up with a colored liquid. We just used a dye to color our water blue and filled it up. And one thing that's really important when you're doing this is to get all the air bubbles out. So we're taking some time to fill it and keep filling it and make sure all of the bubbles are out. You don't want bubbles in there because the bubbles are air which will compress and it'll throw off your level. So get all the bubbles out and basically fill up that line with liquid. Once you do that, you plant a pole in the ground somewhere kind of in the middle of the construction site that'll stay there, and you attach one end of the tube to that stake. And you fix it with wire or whatever to that stake and affix it pretty high. And then on the other end of the tube, you affix it to a post that you can walk around with, just a piece of 2x4 or whatever. And you fix it to where it can't move on that post. And the really cool thing about a water level is that the water level in both ends of that tube will stay the same. If you give it a second to equalize, it'll equalize to within 1/4 to 1/8 of an inch every single time, no matter where you move your stake. And so, you've got 100 foot of tube that you can move anywhere, and wherever you put your post, the water level on both sides will be the same. And so what you do is you just start at one end of your footer and mark the water level and set your post on the frame, mark your water level there, and then start going down your footer, and you can compare it to that mark that you made, and you can see if the water level is above or below that mark, and it'll tell you exactly, where the rest of the frame is in relation to that one starting point. So I got one starting point, one end, exactly where I wanted it as far as elevation, and then I was able to use the water level to go down and, go around corners, go anywhere, and wherever I put that post, I was able to just compare the water level to that mark that I'd made at the origin point and see quickly and easily exactly how far off I was from that level. So really liked using the water level. It was a lot of fun to make and use. It's a super simple and it's super effective, and it's something that you can, one person can use by themselves. You don't need help with. You can just kind of set it off to the side and make frequent checks if you're fine-tuning and making adjustments. So it was a really cool tool. I'm glad I used it, and it worked great. Super simple. So once I had all the adjustments made to the level and I had it perfectly, flat and true where I wanted it, I went ahead and staked in stakes off to each side to secure it in place. And so I wanted to go off to the side a foot or two in order to, drive my stakes in so it wouldn't, collapse my trench as I was digging my stakes in. So I just made these little outrigger boards and, put them every 8 feet or so on down the length, and then staked it in on both sides in order to secure the frame exactly where I wanted it. We also added 4x4s along the inside edge in order to create a step in the footer that would serve as a lip that our floor would rest on. So probably the biggest problem that we ran into with doing the footers this way is that there's a gap between the form and the edge of the trench, because the edge of the trench isn't perfect. It's kind of slumped in areas, and so it's really ragged. The trench mouth at the top is much wider than at the bottom, and so there's these sometimes pretty huge gaps between our form and the ground, and we had to figure out a way to keep the concrete from running out of that hole. You've got to seal it off really nice, otherwise concrete will just be running out everywhere. And at first I was really stumped on how to, bridge that gap, how to seal that up. At first I was thinking, cutting 2x4s and, trying to put 2x4s in and block the gaps, but it just seemed insurmountable. And April came out to help me, and she came up with this awesome idea of using plastic in order to seal up that gap. And I just thought that was the best idea I'd ever heard. And so we got some plastic, some 4mm plastic, and cut it into strips that we laid along the sides. And then we stapled and sometimes screwed a batten board to firmly affix the plastic to the form. And then we dumped in dirt and kind of tucked that dirt underneath the forms and got it just where we wanted, and then packed in a good amount of dirt on it. And then also, packed it in along the outside so the plastic wouldn't, fall into the inside of the trench. And it worked wonderful. It was just the perfect solution. And so we did that all around all the edges of the form. And so we were able to use that plastic in order to fill that. Sometimes, that gap was as much as 6 inches. And we were able to fill that gap with this plastic and dirt, so it was a cheap and really easy solution to fill that gap and to kind of seal off between the form and the ground in order to allow us to have a good pour and not worry about blowouts when we poured that concrete. Once we had the edges sealed, it was time to move on to placing the last 2 courses of rebar. And this needed to be placed, pretty close to the top of the footer. And so in order to do that, we just hung rebar with, baling wire from these blocks that we have, going across the top of the forms. Now those blocks are there to keep the forms in place, keep them the right width apart. And we're also going to use them to hang our connecting rods that'll connect the walls to the footer. So there's multi-purpose, those blocks that go across. They also worked out as the perfect place to hang our rebar from. The day before the pour, we had a nice little rain, which really kind of compacted down the dirt that we had put on top of the plastic and kind of made that even more secure. Also kind of wet down the bottoms of the trench, which wasn't bad for us at all. It's actually good for the trench that you're going to be pouring the concrete into to be moist, to not be super dry, because it helps the concrete to cure better. So that all worked out in our favor. It wasn't such a heavy rain that it made the roads impassable or anything, so it worked out pretty good. I was then also able to use the bending and cutting tool that our friend loaned us in order to easily and quickly make these tie-ins that I put every basically 4 to 6 feet around the perimeter. And it's basically just a piece of 1/2-inch rebar that's about 3 feet long and bent at both ends 90 degrees. And that's to provide a physical connection between the footer and the wall, which will be pouring directly on top of the footers.
A concrete truck is here. We'll see how this goes. Red's definitely nervous. Hope it all goes well.